a lot of the language around boundaries is missing the education part, because we're expecting people to be mind readers, and because we assume everyone's boundaries are the same, we're not actually telling someone when our boundaries are being crossed.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Self-Obsessed podcast. Today we're going to be talking all things boundaries. Boundaries are this essential life skill that teaches you how to draw the line between what you will and will not accept. It teaches you how to say no, and it's essentially the difference between living a life that is catered to your desires rather than other people's. So why do we struggle with it so much? Constantly online, I see so much confusion about how we actually set boundaries. How do we say no? How can we be consistent in maintaining our boundaries with other people? Why do we feel guilty after doing so? And why does people pleasing feel more natural than actually going with our real desire of saying no or cutting off a certain situation? And for that reason, this episode is catered to shutting down all of that confusion and teaching you how to set boundaries for good in every single aspect and in every single situation. I actually went over on my Instagram and asked you all to send me your most common questions and problems when it comes to boundaries, and I've integrated them all into this episode, so no question will be left unanswered. And I actually have the best and most special guest here with me today, who is widely known as the boundary setting queen. And her name is Michelle Elman. She is a life coach, she's a podcaster, and she is an author of many books, some of which include The Selfish Romantic, How to Say No, and her newest release, which is coming out in May, which is called Bad Friend. Michelle has opened the door and paved the way for so many people to be able to start enforcing healthy boundaries into their lives. And you can check out all of her links and socials below to check out her story, which, by the way, is super inspiring, and everything else she does, along with my YouTube channels, the Self-Obsessed newsletter that recently came out. But with that being said, hello, Michelle, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to get into this and dig into all of your boundary setting knowledge.
I know, my favourite topic.
Yes, I can't wait for all of the knowledge you're about to spill. So, in true self-obsessed fashion, we are just going to jump straight into it. And I wanted the first part of the podcast to cover all things boundary misconceptions, which I'm sure you see a lot of. One of the things I wanted to talk about first was this need to people please, and the fact that people kind of drift away from boundary setting because they think people pleasing is the nice thing to do and boundary setting is a selfish thing to do.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the case. You've said in the past that people pleasing can actually be quite manipulative.
Yes, because it's changing yourself in order to get an outcome, whether the outcome is to get someone to like you, to want them to keep dating you, to want to get a job. It's being a different version of yourself, and in that sense you're being inauthentic. I also think it is directly opposite to setting boundaries. You actually can't set a boundary if you have another person's opinion or their perception of you in your brain, and if you do set that boundary, it will either be too weak, you won't reinforce it, or it won't be accurately set.
Okay, interesting. So why do you think so many people love to people please and find it so natural?
As humans, we are social animals. We want to be accepted by our in-group. And so people pleasing, especially within women, it's actually a version of fight or flight. So there's fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And then in women, there's tend and befriend, which is actually what people pleasing is. And so when you are in a threatening position, let's say you're in school and a bunch of mean girls are coming after you, to get them to stop attacking you, which is the equivalent to a tiger coming after you in the jungle, is let's get them on side. And so we think if we can get them to be part of our in-group, we'll be safer. And so it's this idea that at least we'll be liked. But we also have to remember, people pleasing might lead to you being liked, but boundary setting leads to you being respected, which are two different things. And also, people pleasing doesn't even guarantee that you are liked, because we all know a people pleaser, and having someone sucking up to you and saying that you're right with everything isn't always the way to actually get someone to like you. And that anytime you've had that yes person around you, it gets frustrating because you actually just want to know their true opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so much of the time we hear about, boundary setting is going to make people dislike me. It's going to push them away. And while that is true, you're going to push so many people away that are trying to walk all over you. I think you're also going to bring in the right people for you because you're actually being your authentic self, just like you said there. And I think it's really important, especially what you said about people pleasing being manipulative, for people to start getting the ick around people pleasing and start to see the success behind boundary setting. So I would love to know if you have any kind of success story about how setting boundaries in your life has kind of brought you into a more aligned situation around better friendships.
So how I started setting boundaries was I was 21 years old, and it was one day that two things had happened back to back. I'd gone to a friend's birthday party, come home, and I got like 10 missed calls on my phone, a Facebook message, a WhatsApp message from my boyfriend. I just thought something was urgent. I thought like someone had died, frankly. Called him back and he was like, oh, that's strange. No, I just wanted to chat, but you're usually at my beck and call. And it was the fact he said it to my face. It wasn't just the fact he thought it. And then I came home, walked into a fight between all my housemates, and somehow by walking in, I became involved in this argument. And one of my housemates said to me, do you know how much we have to tolerate just by living with you? And it was these back-to-back things of two people saying such horrific things to me in two separate contexts that made me go, what am I doing in my life that has let people think they can speak to me that way and treat me that way? And so that's where my boundary journey started. And what eventually happened was I lost so many friends that I called it the mass exodus, because unfortunately, if you are doing everything you can possibly do to get people to like you, and then you start setting boundaries, a lot of those people are literally only in your life because of what you do for them, not for who you are. And that becomes really illuminated the moment you start setting boundaries. And so there was this really sad period where I just felt like I was losing more friends than keeping them. But the people who remained, my conversations with those friends were so emotionally intelligent, so self-aware. And then also the fact that this thing I used to always have of worrying if my friends were angry with me completely disappeared. So yes, you might have less friends, but my friendships became simpler. I have a saying, which is a very common saying, say what you mean and mean what you say. Boundaries are that. And so if you do that in friendship, it gives them permission to do that with you. So it will be saying something like, can I ask your opinion on something, rather than just blurting out your whole life story? Or it's saying something like, would you like me to listen, or do you want my honest advice? Like, that's where even my friends to this day are really boundaried. I don't know if they are with everyone, but they definitely are with me because I am with them.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you kind of hinted there a little bit about what that switch was like for you, where people were speaking to you in a really unkind way and you found that that was going on and something kind of switched in you where you were like, actually, I have to put an end to this and I have to start treating this a little bit differently. And I think when we're talking about misconceptions and confusion, that is such an obstacle for so many people. It's like, well, if I've been acting a certain way for so long, and once again, there's that little bit of fear there where you're like, well, all these people are in my life, what's going to happen if all of a sudden I start acting in a way that I've never acted before? And that can kind of stop them and hold them back. So do you think there's some sort of strategy where you start to shift how you start speaking to people and how you start boundary setting? Or is it just a matter of, I'm just going to start saying no and I'm just going to jump into it?
Well, the first thing you have to realize is when your boundary is being crossed. And that sounds really simplistic, but actually a lot of people don't know. If you have been a people pleaser, you don't know when your boundaries are being crossed. And if you're that kind of person, you might recognize or resonate with that feeling of going to bed and replaying a conversation in your head because something doesn't sit right, but you're not sure what doesn't sit right. And you wish you'd said something, but you didn't know in the moment your boundary was being crossed. And now, like hours later, even days later, you're still thinking about it. But in that moment, what I remind people is like, just because you realize your boundaries was crossed later doesn't mean you can't set boundaries. You can set boundaries at a later date. And often the way to do that is just say, hey, you know that thing you said last week? It's not been sitting right with me. And then go into setting the boundary how you normally would. But I think if you aren't able to detect when your boundaries are crossed, then you can't set the boundary anyway. Like whether it comes to the language of like, do you actually just say no? Do you say this doesn't work for me? Or whatever language you choose, there are like 3 more steps ahead of that, which is, first of all, you have to know the 2 emotions for your boundaries being crossed are anger and resentment. So if you notice that in your body, it's likely because a boundary has been crossed. And then also noticing how that actually feels in your body. Because if you don't know what anger feels like, and women particularly often don't know what anger feels like because they've been shamed, like, you know, the stereotype of the angry woman.
Yes.
I often say men have been shamed for sadness in the same way women have been shamed for anger. And so you actually have to know what anger feels like in your body, whether that's like a ball in your stomach or a tense feeling in your throat. Like, physically know what it feels like or represents in your body. Same with resentment. And then once you notice that, you actually going, okay, now I need to have a conversation about it.
Okay.
And that's where the language comes in.
I love that. That's a really good practical way of looking at it and actually finding out what your boundaries are. When I asked you guys on my Instagram, that question came up a lot. Like, how do I even know what my boundaries are? And it's like you said, it sounds so simplistic. It sounds like something we should know. But something that's just come up for me now is, if we are paying attention to this has annoyed me and this has made me angry, I think a lot of women especially might have the tendency to think, but what if I'm just overreacting? What if I shouldn't be angry about this? So then I shouldn't actually set a boundary, because am I valid in having this emotion about that?
How you feel is always valid.
Yes.
And with women in particular, I won't say all women, but majority of women, you aren't overreacting. You've been trained by society to think that how you feel is not important, or at least not as important as how everyone else feels. And ultimately that feeling is coming from, I don't want to make other people uncomfortable. But we have to remember that keeping the peace is not the same as avoidance. And a lot of the time, you not having the conversation is avoidance rather than actually peacekeeping.
Yeah.
And also it's disrupting your own peace. So that's where you have to have the conversation, and how you feel is valid. And it doesn't matter if your boundary is different to another person's boundary. So let's say something's happened and you go, well, am I overreacting? Is there someone in the world who wouldn't be upset by that? Yes, absolutely. Does that mean you being upset by that is overreacting? No. You are allowed to be upset by that. And if it's upsetting to you, it doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter that someone else wouldn't. It matters that you actually say something about it, because the people in your life can't know unless you actually communicate it. And this is where a lot of the language around boundaries is missing the education part, because we're expecting people to be mind readers. And because we assume everyone's boundaries are the same, we're not actually telling someone when our boundaries are being crossed. And often the best examples are within a dating context. So to one person, flirting with someone at a party is inappropriate. To another person, it only counts as cheating if you actually sleep with them.
Yeah.
To another person, if you sent someone a DM, that's cheating. You need to have that conversation. If you don't have that conversation, you could both be living with two different set of boundaries, both perceive it not as cheating, and then you have a conversation, you realize you're not aligned, and then go, oh, we've just not actually matched up what I want for my relationship, and that's why you have to communicate it. I always think you can't teach boundaries without teaching good communication.
Yeah, that's so important. And going back a little bit on what you said about women have been trained in a way to see themselves as, I'm overreacting, or I shouldn't be angry, and I shouldn't be loud. I also wanted to bring this back to the dating world, because I feel like I was affected by this in the way of feeling like I need to be the easygoing, really nice girlfriend. So many times in my dating life, I was just going with the flow of what the guy wanted. So no boundaries were even there. And the only time I set boundaries was when I was dating the partner I'm with now. And I just decided, I'd just gone on this year of self-love. I was dating myself. I was finding out who I was. I finally fell in love with my independence. I didn't need male validation anymore. So when I came back to the dating world, I was so outspoken in what I wanted. And I just communicated. I was like, I'm not going to text you all day because my career comes first. I will call you before bed. That's what I'd like one call at nighttime. I can see you once a week on a proper date. But other than that, I will not be texting you all the time. And I need you to understand, I'm not going to reply straight away.
It's so funny. So many of those conversations are exactly the kind of conversations I have in dating.
Yeah.
So I had a conversation saying I don't text guys I'm dating between 9 to 6.
Love.
I'll reply to you after work. I was dating a guy who was living outside of London, and immediately I was like, sorry, I'm looking for guys in London. And he was like, well, what if I can guarantee I can travel to you 3 times a week? And I was like, yeah, that's fine, because I only date guys once a week. So I was like, okay, but then I've set the boundary of you're traveling to me, I'm not traveling. And it's having those conversations, it's setting a precedent for it. And also by being that person who knows how you want to be treated, it actually communicates self-worth. Whereas when you are a person who's so desperate to be liked, actually the person you're dating is somewhat interchangeable, because like you don't care who likes you. You just want whatever guy that is to like you. And that's where I think that person can feel that energy. And ultimately, I take the point of view that humans are lazy creatures and we will always go the route that is easiest. And so if a person knows they can take advantage of you, and not even in malicious ways, but for example, if I know you're always going to reply at 2:00 in the morning, and it's convenient for me to text you at 2:00 in the morning, it's convenient for me to set up dates 24 hours before and not actually plan it, then why would I bother making more effort?
Yeah, 100%. So next up, I wanted to ask another really common question that you guys sent over. Somebody asked, what are some common boundaries that everybody should have? And this really intrigued me because I've always thought boundaries are very personal. It's like what you said before, like what suits one person, somebody else doesn't really care about. But I think as a boundary setting queen, have you kind of got an opinion where you're like, this is like the bare minimum of boundaries that everybody should be enforcing?
I don't like to say that, but I also think there is a bare minimum of how you should be treated.
Yeah.
And things like no yelling, no screaming, no name calling. But I think to write blanket rules for everyone, like, depends on your culture, what you consider raising your voice, depends on like your upbringing, whether having to not swear is actually a harder thing for you, a less hard thing for you. So I wouldn't in general do that, but I do think there is a bare minimum of how you should be treated and you should know that.
And going back to what you said about, everybody has a different opinion about what's right versus wrong, I think that can cause some clashes and differences when it comes to somebody else setting a boundary with you. And one thing we always do on this podcast is, we'll have a look at the toxic traits that somebody else could have. So then we know how to identify when somebody else is mistreating us, but also we have to look inwards to see actually how am I responding, or am I acting in the right way, or is there some work I can do on myself to make sure I'm not projecting on others. And so when it comes to boundaries, I think it's really important to discuss how can we ensure that we are respecting other people's boundaries. So we know how to enforce them, but is there kind of a right way to be when somebody else is setting it with us? How should we behave?
Yeah, I think in the conversation, you want to keep your feelings out of it as much as possible. Keep it emotionally neutral. And what I mean by that is, let's say you've just set a boundary with me and it's made me either angry or upset or scared or even feeling a little bit guilty. I can say to you, thank you so much for letting me know. I really appreciate that. Take my feelings away, go have my feelings, and then be like, that boundary you set with me the other day, I was having a think about it and I really respect the boundary, but there was something you said in that conversation that kind of left me a little bit sad. And it could be around something where you said you basically misinterpreted my intention. And I could say like, I was a bit upset that you kind of assumed the worst of me. Like, I really want to know your boundaries. I am actually so glad you told me, and I really respect the fact that you were able to be vulnerable and honest with me. But when you said this, it kind of implied that I was trying to hurt you. And I hope you know that my intention is never to do that within friendship, but also specifically within our friendship.
Yeah, that's so important. That actually leads me onto the next part of the podcast, which is all about how to set boundaries. And I want to move on to this really quickly because it links on from what you said. I love that you communicated there really clearly about, I respect what you're saying, but this hurt me in a certain way. And I think this highlights a really common problem that people have. And the most common question I always see on the internet, which is, how do I set boundaries respectfully, politely, healthily, without hurting the other person? And I actually wrote this in my book, a kind of dialogue example of how to set a boundary in a way that doesn't make you feel uncomfortable and wouldn't hurt the person. So I said, you should always lead with your feelings rather than trying to vilify the other person and kind of make assumptions about what their actions meant. Focus on, this is what the action was and this is how it's made me feel, rather than, I can't believe you did this, or start to assume the worst, because that's when those difficult conversations come up. So I'd love to know, do you have this kind of example of, this is how I would structure setting a boundary that makes it a little bit easier for each party?
What you're saying about the language is really important, because I think that's actually just good communication of like, you don't want to be coming across an accusatory manner.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the emotionally neutral part, and I understand when boundaries come in, it is very hard to be emotionally neutral. But that's why sometimes you actually do need to consciously take space and come back to the conversation. But I think what's really crucial and is like a general life coaching principle is separate the stories out from the fact. So let's say you ignore my text for weeks. The story I'm telling myself is you don't care about our friendship. I don't know that. I'm not in your body. So I can't decide that. The fact is you haven't replied to my text for 3 weeks. That is the fact. Stick to the fact. So in the boundary, it could be, hey, I noticed you haven't replied to my text for the last 3 weeks and that upsets me. So again, back to what you were saying around my feelings, but I can't set a boundary around you caring about me or you replying to me promptly. Anything that's vague doesn't really work. Or I've even heard people try to set a boundary around you can't upset me. And I was like, how is someone meant to know what upsets you? That's vague, confusing. Make it very specific, make it around the behavior, not around your feelings. And then that's where you can say, next time in the future, I would prefer if you, and then that's outlining how you actually want to be treated.
Yeah. And that covers a really common confusion that a lot of other people have, which is why they fear being mean and why they feel guilty afterwards is they think by setting a boundary, they are controlling the other person's actions. But that's not involved in boundary setting. It's about you not changing the other person.
Well, also, so my answer to that is that you set the boundary, they have all choice in the world to do whatever they want. They can choose to continue ignoring the boundary, but if they do that, there are going to be consequences to that. So if you continue to speak to me like that, I will be walking out the room. Okay. That's the consequence. So they raise their voice once, you go, please don't speak to me like that. They do it again. If you continue to speak to me like that, I'll be walking out the room and you can come find me when you're ready to talk to me in a respectful manner.
So we touched a little bit on dating and now I want to go into other areas of our lives when it comes to boundary setting, starting off with family, because I think that is really hard and really unnatural for some people. It's a difficult dynamic to manage, especially if maybe you have toxic parents or maybe you don't and you just don't quite know how to approach it. Have you had any experience in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think your relationships with your families are your most ingrained relationships. So if they're used to a certain version of you, trying to change that and become a different person will be really hard and it will take time for them to adjust. And especially within different cultures, I don't want to say it's not allowed, but the idea of talking back to elders
100%
is very controversial. But I do think that family have to have the same boundaries as anyone else in your life. And unfortunately, something that's really taboo is cutting out family members. And I think it has to be an option because there has to be a limit of if someone continues to cross your boundaries and continues to treat you in a way that doesn't work for you, you need to be able to enforce that and know that yes, it's great that they raised you and all of that, but that's actually the job of a parent.
Yeah.
And now it's your turn to decide your own life and you don't need your parents' approval in adulthood to make your own decisions.
Yeah, I've had experience with cutting off family members and it was a really hard place to get to. And it just made me realise I wouldn't let a friend speak to me this way. I wouldn't let a partner treat me this way. If you are a figure in my life who has probably the most important title of all, why do you get to treat me this way? Because then the weight of your actions is even heavier.
And I think sometimes the reason why they treat you worse than anyone else in your life is because it's this embedded assumption that you're not going to cut them out, that you are stuck together no matter what. We get raised with phrases like blood is thicker than water, but actually it's blood of the covenant is thicker than water of the womb, which means the literal opposite of how we use that phrase.
I cannot tell you how many times I've heard in my life blood is thicker than water, so that has blown my mind. But let's say maybe for younger people who are still relying on their parents, they have to live at home, cutting family members off or distancing themselves from them isn't necessarily an option.
Yeah.
What would you say to people who are struggling and their boundaries are consistently dismissed?
I would do two things. One, see them enough that you will still be able to have your financial dependence on them, but also then limiting their access. They don't need to know everything about your life. And I think sometimes when you've not had approval from your parents, you overcompensate and tell them more to try to get them on side. Every time you give someone access to information, you are also opening yourself up to their opinions.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, because there has to be a consequence of some sort. And I guess if you're still dependent on them, then it should be distancing yourself, being a little bit less vulnerable. And if they call you out on that, then maybe that's another chance to reinforce your boundary of, I don't feel comfortable sharing this with you because I've asked you to act in this way or speak in this way, and that's consistently dismissed. So I can't show up in this way anymore.
And I think if you have to keep that person in your life, you have to continually keep trying to set those boundaries, because actually sometimes someone needs to hear it like one too many times. I remember there was a family member who used to really body shame me every time I wore bikinis, and every single day I came down, it would be a comment about like, do you really have to wear that? Like, no one wants to do all of it. I carried on wearing bikinis for years. It took about 2 years, but finally the comments stopped. Because like, if you continue to do it your way, I didn't cut that family member out, because cutting out that family member would have meant not having a relationship with other people that I did want a relationship with. And in that moment, I made a conscious decision, and this is what I tell people to do within life coaching, is I made a conscious decision that the transaction I was making by interacting with that one person I didn't want to interact with was the relationship with two people who I did care about. So anytime that person disrespected my boundaries or walked all over me or said something rude or a body shaming comment, I literally saw that as the transaction for being in touch with two of my family members.
Okay, wow. And this links on to maintaining boundaries, which was another concern that a lot of people had. How do I be consistent with it? You know, like I'll set it once and then I kind of maybe get scared or I fall inconsistent with it. And I found what you said there really interesting, because you weren't necessarily saying something. You were just repeatedly doing what you needed to do.
I was also emotionally detaching.
Okay.
So I at certain points, that comment would have affected me and it wasn't upsetting me, but I would set the boundary a lot of the time. I would say something like, that was an unnecessary comment. You didn't need to say that.
Yeah.
And then I would carry on my day. I would walk away. I wouldn't engage with it. And once I decided that, no, this is the relationship, this is the transaction of I tolerate disrespect in order to have two people I care about in my life, then I was able to go like, no, your opinion doesn't matter to me anymore.
Yeah. And how would you approach boundary setting in the workplace, where the concern is, I don't want to affect my likelihood for promotion or excelling in the workplace. I want to make sure that all of my colleagues like me. You know, if maybe I set a boundary with one, then other people team up and then it's this whole thing. And every day I have to come to work and it's awkward.
Yeah. I think with the workplace, we set this almost double bind of, I have to be a pushover, people pleaser, do everything my colleagues like, or I'll get fired. And actually, that's not true. That's a story you're telling yourself. And a lot of the times, if you set boundaries, the company, your boss, your colleagues will respect you more, because you have to remember it's in the company's motivation to get as much work as possible out of you for as little money. And it is your motivation to take care of yourself. And if you're going to do the job of 4 people, but being paid for the job of 1, then why would they pay you more? Yeah. And this mentality of like, if you go over and beyond, they'll appreciate it. No, we're in a cost of living crisis. They won't just appreciate it, they'll take advantage of it. Everyone in the office knows the one person you can dump your extra workload on. You don't want to be that person.
Yeah, it's like what you said before, human beings are lazy people.
Yeah.
If they can get away with something, they're just going to continue in that space. And it was a huge lesson I learned in the dating world when I was like, I'm just going to set these few standards. Nobody's ever going to go beyond that. They might have all of the capabilities in the world to treat you 10 times better and be super romantic. But if you're satisfied with 2 or 3 things, they're just going to stay at that level of 2 or 3 things.
Absolutely. And also sometimes pushing back, we see it as this massive confrontation, and it doesn't need to be that. Like, it can be someone being like, hey, didn't have time to finish this. Here's what you need to finish next week. And you going, oh, I actually don't have time for that. You're going to have to do it yourself.
This reminds me, I used to see videos on my TikTok For You page. Somebody made like a little cartoon animation. Have you seen it? Where it's like a workplace scenario and there's this little cartoon character who's, like you said, the person that everybody dumps their work on. And in this mini cartoon, she always turns around and responds in the correct boundary setting way of, actually, I'm not paid to do this role, so I won't be able to, but I'm happy to do it if we can discuss a pay rise. And I think that's also a really useful way of looking at it, like looking up examples of how could I say this, because there is so much content out there that could help you in doing so.
So I had this actually recently. So I said yes to doing 2 episodes for a certain price. I went in and they put me on 3. And I said, I'm happy to do that for you. It will cost you the usual rate. But to try to just like squeeze you out a little bit more, if I hadn't said anything, that would become my new rate of like for 3 episodes instead of 2. So I was like, happy to do it for you. And financial compensation is needed, is essentially what I was saying. But I think that's where, when it comes to overtime, when it comes to working weekends, like saying to your boss, hey, if we look at my contract, actually, these are my hours. I've noticed I've started working longer hours as a result of that. I'm totally happy with that. But as a result, I'm going to need my hours to be reflected in my pay.
Yeah, there you go. And it's like you said, that's polite. You didn't kick up a fuss. You didn't need to raise your voice. It doesn't have to be impolite.
And if they come back to you and they say, we don't have budget for that, I'm like, great, okay. Well, then in that case, I won't be working weekends until that budget becomes available.
There you go, yeah. So why do so many people think that boundary setting is confrontational?
Because that's terrifying to say that. It would be terrifying for me. I would still say it, but I would be scared saying it. And I think this is where we sometimes wait for that moment to pass and like want us to not be scared by doing it. You will be scared doing it. Like, you are doing something new. If you've never set boundaries in the workplace, of course you're going to be scared. You can do it scared. And I do all these things scared. The number of times I've sent emails and then put my phone on airplane mode and thrown it halfway across the room because I'm terrified for the response. But I don't set the boundary in language of me communicating that fear. Like, as I said around friendship earlier, I set the boundary, then I go deal with my feelings later. Like, your feelings don't dictate your communication.
That's so important. I think that's the thing that stops so many people. They're like, I don't feel ready. And we are
You would never will feel ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For literally, and it applies to so many things in life. I always talk about building your confidence, stepping outside of your comfort zone. In order to get to the most confident version of yourself, you have to start doing those same actions scared. The fear is eventually going to fade away.
Also, you know, the funniest thing is if you become a person who's so used to boundary setting and you set boundaries all the time, people actually almost account for that. So the number of times I've heard like comments from the corner of the room going, oh, that's just Michelle being Michelle. Like, but it's fine. You say whatever you need
At least
to feel comfortable with my boundaries.
Yeah.
But they know they can't do that to me anymore. Where it's like, okay, Michelle can be Michelle, but like the other person in the room who's saying yes to everything, you might get nicer comments. You might not be called rude, harsh, aggressive. Especially women get called all these names, a difficult woman to work with. But if you are the easy person to work with, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the one up for promotion. You're not going to be the one who gets that job. It just means you are liked more, but it doesn't mean you're respected more.
Yes. So when we now talk about practical ways to set a boundary, we already spoke about the fact that we don't need to be so concerned about the other person's response and how we're going to be nice to them. But what are some of the key and top tips or words or phrases that you would use to be able to enforce a boundary, which you think, everybody can start implementing, just to have that little guideline in their head of, this kind of removes the obstacle. I know I'm scared, but at least I know what to say.
So less is more. We tend to over-justify. If we don't feel completely secure in our boundary, we will talk and talk and talk. For example, if someone's trying to cancel an event, or not cancel an event, actually just say no to an event when it comes in, they send paragraphs back of like, I've got this, and then I've got this, and I've got so much work on, like, I just needed a yes or no.
Yeah.
And so the first and simplest boundary is the word no. No. We actually know that as children. We unlearn our boundaries. We all know our boundaries when you're a 2-year-old screaming and someone's taken your toy, or you get put in the arms of someone who you don't like. A child will scream no. We stop learning that when we're 3 to 4 years old because there's something called theory of mind where we start to realize that other humans think. And if other humans can think, they can think about us. And that's how setting boundaries becomes harder, because now I'm taking into consideration what you think of me. And then when it actually comes to the words, no is obviously the first and easiest, but saying no, yes, no is a complete sentence. But sometimes that's not practical. One of my favorites is this doesn't work for me.
Okay.
Or that's not appropriate.
And that's it?
Yep.
Just that sentence?
In dating, a lot of the time I use this doesn't work for me. So for example, someone texts me at 2 a.m. Hey, thank you so much for your text. I actually don't reply at that hour. This doesn't work for me. If you want to plan a date, then you need to text me during normal hours.
Have you seen any difference in boundary setting patterns or behavior between men and women?
Yes, men are far better at it because they've been allowed to be better at it, and they don't get the stigma of setting a boundary and being perceived as difficult. If a man sets boundaries, they are seen as self-assured, whereas if a woman does it, they're being difficult because we are meant to put everyone else first. If you think about the women who are complimented in the world, oftentimes it's because they are considered selfless. They put everyone else first, and therefore we are meant to be the givers of the world. So we will get a harsher response when we set boundaries. But as I said, after a certain point, people get used to the fact that you set boundaries and you're not going to be walked all over, and then they will come to respect it. Whether they like it or not is a different conversation.
Yeah. And that really links into something that I always say, which is there's so much power in being disliked. And the sooner that you accept that people are going to dislike me, I think it's very
but
healthy.
Also, you don't like everyone either.
Exactly. Like, I dislike people. It's great that they dislike me. That's how you know who is meant for you and who is not meant for you. We've spoken quite a bit about setting boundaries in the dating world, with family, with colleagues, with just people in general. So now I want to bring this back to ourselves. The reason that this podcast is called Self-Obsessed is because we're obsessed with all things self. So that's self-care, self-love, self-belief, self-confidence. There's been this word that's been thrown around, this phrase of self-boundaries, setting boundaries with yourself, kind of setting a boundary with maybe how you're showing up in your work, in the way that you procrastinate. Maybe you're using your phone too much. You need to set that boundary with yourself. What is your opinion on this?
I don't think you can set boundaries with yourself. If you look at the definition of the word boundaries, it's how you teach other people to treat you. It's the line between who you are and who the world wants you to be. So how do you set a boundary with yourself? You can set a boundary with your phone. I think where this language has started coming in is when we start hearing a word on social media, it just seeps into everything. We've seen it with gaslighting too. Now people are saying you can gaslight yourself. You actually can't gaslight yourself. You can't be both in your mind and out of your mind. In the same way that if we think about boundaries being a house, you can't be both in the house and out of the house.
Okay.
So boundaries are keeping other people in the house and allowing who you want to come through the door. How the heck can you be in and out of the house at the same time?
Yeah.
So in my mind, it doesn't work. The reason why people have started talking about boundaries with yourself is because everything ultimately comes down to this idea of like self-discipline is the crux of becoming a better person. And actually, I think discipline in itself is a bit overrated. Like when it comes to how people use this language, what they're actually talking about is following through on what you say. And actually, that's a completely different thing. You can be good at boundaries and bad at following through. You can be good at following through and awful at boundaries. I don't think using one label to mean everything is a helpful thing, and it's confusing, and it means we lose the original definition of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're not here for it, you know?
I mean, you can have discipline. You can follow through on things you say you're going to do. That's not having boundaries with yourself.
So you said you could set a boundary with your phone. Let's take work, for example. You're setting a boundary with your work. Maybe you're somebody who overworks yourself all of the time and you're trying to be more productive in all areas of your life. You want to also balance seeing your friends, seeing your family, taking time for yourself. In that context, would you say that it makes sense?
You're having boundaries with your time.
With your time.
Let's say you're not going to work after 6 p.m. You're following through on your boundaries with your time. Like they're not boundaries with yourself. They're boundaries with your work. If you have a boundary where you don't take your phone out when you're with your friends so that you don't get distracted by work emails, those are friendship boundaries. They're not boundaries with yourself, they're boundaries with your phone. Do you get what I mean? It gets very confusing when this language is so encapsulating for everything. In the same way we've done with self-love or self-care, all of these terms are so lofty now because they're meant to mean everything.
Speaking of self-love and self-care, how do you think that links into boundary setting? Like, somebody has to have a certain level of self-love to be able to enforce their boundaries.
So you have to believe you deserve boundaries. And that's where this conversation of like, oh, well, maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I was overreacting. That's actually coming from someone who lacks self-esteem. But also when it comes to self-care, this idea that like self-love and self-care are really important as long as you have taken care of everyone and everything else first, doesn't work. There's no time and energy left. If you look at the word selfish, it means to disregard someone else's needs. And the reason why the book's called The Joy of Being Selfish is because you do actually have to disregard someone else's need in order to put yourself first. So let's say you're exhausted, you get home tonight and you want to rest, but then your boss is sending you an email saying, hey, I need an urgent reply to this. You need to disregard your boss's need for a reply, your boss's email, in order to actually rest. My need for rest, your need for a reply has to go lower. And it's not this optional thing. It's actually compulsory in order to prioritize yourself.
So did you find on your own personal growth journey kind of a difference from when you first started setting boundaries, and maybe like, were you on your confidence journey? Did you find that as you got to know yourself a little bit more, as you developed more, as your confidence grew, it got easier to set boundaries? Or was there anything kind of that you set in place from a self-development perspective that you were like, okay, now that I've got this, now that I've built my self-esteem, this is easier. I know that I can do this now.
Well, nothing gets harder by doing it more. And nothing gets easier by not doing it. So that's the thing that we have to remember with boundaries. If you're scared to set boundaries, in 5 years, it's going to be harder to set boundaries. It's going to be scarier to set boundaries. And so I think practice always helps. The gift of boundaries is that you telling other people how to treat you is also telling yourself how you deserve to be treated. And it's basically you standing up for yourself. Like, I almost see it as me being a mother to myself. And that's what I believe self-love is. Is being that protective parent of coming in and being like, if you saw a 7-year-old child being body shamed, you'd be like, excuse me, do not speak to her like that. So when someone body shames me and I go, do not speak to me like that, I am literally being that mother to that 7-year-old.
I love that. That's beautiful. Yeah, I've always seen the definition of self-love like that. It's like parenting yourself, because that's what most people see as the highest, most unconditional form of love.
Yeah.
So to finish off this episode, before we finish off with homework, as we always do, the last question I wanted to ask you is something I haven't seen a lot of people ask before when it comes to boundaries. And I think it's really important in a time where social media is everything, everybody's on it, and there is this rise of the content creator. Anybody can create content now and cultivate a really large online following. What has been your experience in setting boundaries in the digital age, in the online space, where there is such a pressure to be vulnerable and share things because, well, all these other creators are doing it, and then your audience wants you to be vulnerable, and then you don't want to be too private, but you also want to keep things to yourself? I think it can be a really confusing space.
So I think there's a difference between privacy and honesty, and I don't think you should share anything that you have not processed yourself. So I share this phrase a lot because actually how my Instagram page started was my username was Scarred Not Scared. And I used to say a lot, share your scars, not your wounds, which means let them heal and then share from a place where you can tell the lessons in hindsight, but not sharing from the pain point where you are still vulnerable and raw. Yeah. And if someone said a comment in the comment section, it would actually hurt. And so I think that's important, but also not looking at other people's content. When you're looking at other people's content and comparing, there are always going to be people sharing more than you. And you don't want to be monetizing that or working in an industry where you have to exchange your trauma and that amount of information for your success, because in the long run, that is going to do such a detriment to you. And I've gone too far down the oversharing path and you can't take it back. And whereas now, if I'm unsure, I won't share it. I can always share it at a later date. But once you said it, you can't take it back.
So is this more of this is the decision I'm making for myself, this is simply what I'm not going to do? Like, you're choosing that I'm just not going to speak about this, which of course it is. But also, would you ever, or have you ever actually communicate with your audience online and say something along the lines of, you cannot push me to speak about something that
so I never shared my boyfriend for 3 years.
Did people actually ask you, or were they ever pushing for it?
People would ask and I would be like, I'm not sharing my boyfriend. And then the joke of it is I shared him when he was my fiance. And the caption was, I told you I'd never share my boyfriend, meet my fiance. But I always said, and I'd done it in that language intentionally, I will never share my boyfriend. Yeah. And I don't really share my friends on there, and I don't really share my family on there. Yeah. And I did say to my audience, I know you think you know every single thing about me, but if I asked you how many siblings I have, you would not know. And it was this moment where like a lot of my followers laughed about it. They were like, I've never thought about that. I was like, this is what I mean. This is why you have to keep in check that these parasocial relationships are not real relationships, because there is no one in your day-to-day life who you wouldn't know if they have siblings. Whereas like, you don't know if I have siblings because you've just not seen that element of me. But also that what I choose to share is enough, that you don't get to push that line and push that boundary. So I would communicate it. Oftentimes I do a Q&A every Monday on Instagram. And oftentimes that would be like, are you ever going to share your boyfriend? Are you like all of that? And I would be like, I would either not reply to that question, or I would reply to that question and be like, guys, it's the same answer.
Love that. I love that you actually communicated it. Did you find that people respected it, or did you get backlash?
I mean, my most Google thing was Michelle Elman boyfriend. Oh, so clearly,
oh my goodness.
Clearly people are trying to find out other ways, but they can't find a photo that doesn't exist. So like,
yeah. Wow. that brings us to the end of the episode. But in true self-obsessed fashion, at the end of every single podcast episode and the end of all of my YouTube videos, there is always a homework section so that we can basically summarize what's been said in this episode so that you can remember what you've been taught and you can go away with one practical piece of advice that you can start implementing straight away. And of course, today it's going to be on boundaries. So I wanted to ask you if you could give people out there who are still at the start of their boundary setting journey, they're still going through the people pleasing, they're feeling a little bit guilty, they don't really know what to start. How would you summarize your top 3 tips on what they should do right now to get started?
So the first thing is actually get used to asking yourself if you want to do something. That now sounds really obvious, but I think especially when it comes to our calendars, we have a knee-jerk reaction of seeing an empty spot and filling it rather than actually going, do I want to go? If you already know you're going to want to cancel and you have a feeling of dread around it, do not be that person who cancels last minute. Be the person who says no in the first instance.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is, as we're coming up to Christmas, you will be short on time. And especially with Christmas, the way someone speaks to you is really important. And when you go to family events, for example, people will have a lot of opinions around what you're doing in your life, and you need to know that line. Start using the sentence of "you're allowed to think that." Stop trying to change people's mind about you. Stop trying to control someone's perception of you. If someone thinks you're rude, you're allowed to think that. That's one of my favorite boundaries to start with. And then the third thing I would say is actually start paying attention to that anger and resentment inside your body and noticing it, and then actually acting on boundaries that you should have set in the past. So if there are still things you're sitting on and that you're not saying, you have to remember the only person you can communicate that to who will actually make a difference is the person you have an issue to. So stop talking to other people about the things that upset you, because it's bitching, it's gossiping, and it's not nice to that person.
It's just not productive.
But also, you're not giving that person an opportunity to change. And ultimately, if you're in a relationship with someone in no matter what way, like whether it's a work relationship or a friendship, give them enough grace to change their behavior. And I understand the story in your head is likely that they won't change. Give them a chance, because otherwise, then you aren't communicating either.
My thing that personally changed my life with boundaries was to stop thinking about how is this going to look and what are people going to think, and instead change that question that I'm thinking in my head to how does this serve me? How is this going to make me feel? Does this make me excited, or is it something I have to force myself through? E.g. by going to an event I don't really want to go to, by cancelling something I don't want to be at, by meeting somebody that's not really my cup of tea. Changing those questions made everything so much easier and allowed me to say no so much faster. I spent so many years of my life just going to things because I was like, it's the nice thing to do, or I just should do it, or I don't really have an excuse. You not wanting to do the thing is the excuse.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank
that brings
you so
us to
much.
the end. This was such an amazing conversation. I personally learned so much from you. And I cannot wait for your new book to come out. If you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's called Bad Friends, Why Friendship Breakups Hurt and How to Heal. It is all about setting boundaries with your friends, having those difficult conversations, actually facing the difficult conversations, because unfortunately, when it comes to friendship breakup, the norm is to ghost your friends. And I really don't believe in that. But I also think that friendship breakup is a conversation that's really underrated. When looking at the research, it actually shows that on average, we make about 29 friends in a lifetime and we only keep about 6, which means we're going through 23 friendship breakups. So if you feel alone in your friendship breakup, you are not the only one. Trust me.
Oh, that's such a nice, reassuring note to end the episode on. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, that brings us to the end. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. I hope you took away some amazing pieces of advice today and you're going to use that homework to start implementing it and changing your life for the better. I will see you guys same time next week on Wednesday for a brand new episode. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram and check out the newsletter for your daily piece of self-obsessed confidence. And that brings us to an end. Bye, everyone.